And welcome back to our next edition of the CBB Review Studio podcast. I am Dan Siegel, joined today by my co-host, Mat Mlodzinski, and we are here with part 3 of our Transfer Portal Winners and Losers series. So if you want to check back, we did the ACC and Big East already, and today we're talking Big Ten. Before we get started, of course, as usual, wanted to remind you all, if you have found our channel and you have enjoyed our content, be sure to like our video and be sure to subscribe. Helps us out. We're trying to get those numbers up here in the off season, and we will continue with content throughout the off season. So appreciate you all. It costs nothing on your end. Let's get started. So Big Ten transfer portal winners and losers. We'll start with the losers and then we'll get to the winners. So I'll throw it to you, Matt. What is your first Big Ten loser from this transfer portal cycle?
You said loser?
Loser, yeah.
Okay, cool. We're starting from the bottom up. You caught me off guard there, but I'm going to go with a team that actually caught me off guard with not bringing in enough guys, and that's Illinois. I mean, we talk about a Fighting Illini team that loses Coleman Hawkins to Kansas State for one of the biggest NIL deals in history. Also lose Dane Danger to Memphis. So the Fighting Illini are going to have a much different front court than this past season. And then on a lower note, Sincere Harris also moves on. They bring in Trey White. They bring in Ben Humrichus. I'm probably saying that wrong. I know that he was pretty good at the mid-major level. And they bring in Kylan Boswell from Arizona. So certainly some talent here on the Illinois end. But I'm just afraid that, I mean, you lose Coleman Hawkins. You lose Dane Danger. That's a lot of rebounding. That's a lot of scoring when you put Sincere Harris in the mix. I'm not sure if these new guys that the Fighting Illini are bringing in are going to be able to keep them at the top. Illinois has been at the top of the Big Ten for the past handful of years. I'm just afraid that these new guys aren't at that level that Illinois is going to need. I know that Brad Underwood's a good coach. I know that he's a good recruiter. I know that Illinois has enough talent to stay in the top 10 in the Big Ten, top half of the Big Ten. But I don't think we're going to see this Illinois team that's in the top 25 like they've been. I think they're going to take a bit of a step back. And that's concerning because Illinois isn't – they're kind of like that step in between. They're nowhere near a blue blood, but they're a pretty big program, right? Illinois has had some pretty good years. I don't know if they're going to be at that level this year, and they're the type of program that they need to make sure they don't slip off because they're very capable of slipping off and being at the bottom of the Big Ten for a while. They've had stretches in their program's history where Illinois hasn't been too relevant, and this transfer portal class screams inconsistency.
Yeah, Hawkins definitely a big loss off to Kansas State. I think getting Boswell and a couple other guys will keep them afloat. Like you said, top half Big Ten. I'd even be willing to say top third, although there are new teams, and we'll talk about those new teams. And some of those new teams are actually going to be more successful. I'll just put it that way. But I think Boswell keeps them afloat. They were in my honorable mention losers because maybe Boswell breaks out and really has a great year, but losing Coleman Hawkins is absolutely huge. He's a lot of proven production. He was a staple next to Terrence Shannon Jr. last year. So that is absolutely a valid pick there. One of my losers, I'm going to go with the Iowa Hawkeyes. And it's not necessarily because of who they lose, which they did lose Tony Perkins. He's off to Missouri. Ben Krikke graduated. And I think Iowa, after another underwhelming year, really needed a reason for optimism, really needed something to convince me that they were going to be vastly improved next year. And they didn't get it. They brought in 2 guys from mid-major schools. They were unranked. They are uninspiring. And I'm not seeing any reason for Iowa to be out of the basement or at least like the middle bottom of the Big Ten next year, just because their roster is not looking phenomenal next year. So nobody to replace Krikke or Perkins. And they have a couple returning guys, but I have Iowa in my transfer portal losers. I think they needed a pretty good haul or two to leave me optimistic for next season.
Yeah, Iowa was kind of in my honorable mention list as a loser as well. So I'm with you on that. The Hawkeyes just not a great, not a transfer portal class that moves the needle, to put it lightly. I went with a similar team. Let's look at Northwestern, right? I mean, Northwestern brought in a couple of guys, but again, nothing that moves the needle. And for me, this is where I'm holding Northwestern to. this is a program that has turned itself into something lately, right? I think we can agree that they're not just a one-hit wonder. Northwestern's now been good for a few seasons. They lose Boo Buie, but they bring back the rest of that roster off last year's team that was a pretty good team, right? I think we can agree, too, that Northwestern had one of their better years over this past string of success last season. How are they not able to bring in a star to replace Boo Buie, right? Like, it doesn't have to be a top 10 guy in the portal, but if you bring in someone, if you get one transfer to try to replace his production, you've got everything else. You've got Langborg, you've got Ty Berry, you've got this whole roster of guys from last year's really talented team. You're not able to bring in a replacement for Boo Buie. I believe in Chris Collins as a head coach. I believe that Northwestern is going to be a very competitive team in the Big Ten. Maybe someone's just going to step up, right? Maybe it's just going to be one of their current players is going to step up and things will all work out. But in the age of adding talent to strengthen your team, I think Northwestern kind of dropped the ball here because they had a chance to be really, really good next year if they just got someone.
I really didn't have Northwestern in my consideration. You do make a pretty compelling case here, but there's just a couple teams I really thought felt a little bit more of transfer portal losers in the cycle. One of them I'm going to talk about right now. That's Minnesota. They have a lot of guys that are coming in, like in terms of quantity, but nobody I'm excited about, right? And you got Elijah Hawkins is off to Texas Tech, Cam Christie off to the NBA draft. It's a situation like Iowa. Minnesota is not a program coming off of a very good year, a very good stretch, and there's just not much reason to expect things to improve given they didn't bring in any names that are really worth talking about. So not really much to add there. Minnesota is another loser for me.
Yeah, and for my final loser, waiting for the lower third here, I'm bringing up Wisconsin. The Badgers, to me, just lost just about everything they could have lost, and it's been a rough few years for Wisconsin because coming into last season, a lot of people felt, including me, that Wisconsin, a 20-win team from the year before, that brings back virtually everything, right? They're going to have the gel, they're going to have the consistency, the chemistry to be really, really good, and we didn't see it one bit from this Badgers team. So, overhaul, completely, right? Like, let's change things up before Wisconsin. It didn't work. We need to change things up. So they lose A.J. Storr. They lose four-star Gussie Alden, who didn't play, but certainly a lot of talent. If he were to play, could have been a big-time player on this year's team. Chucky Hepburn, a couple other guys. So a lot of talent from Wisconsin moves on. Here's what I put down for in. You probably won't be able to read this. I'm not going to show the camera, but I just wrote down 3 question marks because I really don't know what Wisconsin has that's going to be able to make them relevant, especially when you lose a guy like A.J. Storr. I mean, this guy, and I know that his career path has been, let's just move on to the new school every single season, but it's just too bad that Wisconsin wasn't able to keep him because he did turn into a true star in college basketball, not just a Big East star like he has been in the past at St. John's, but a true college basketball star, and now he's going to be a college basketball star somewhere else. And, yeah, it's tough when you lose a guy like A.J. Storr. It's tough when you lose other guys. Wisconsin's in a big rut right now. And this, unlike Illinois, is a team that I think it's better when Wisconsin's good at college basketball. They're more often than not a pretty good team in the Big Ten. And I don't really see it with this roster. I really fear that Wisconsin is going to miss the NCAA tournament. And a lot of it just rests on the fact that they had a terrible offseason with the transfer portal.
Yeah, A.J. Storr, I believe, off to Kansas, right? So that's a big ad for them. We'll talk about them in our Big 12 show. But Rutgers is going to be my third loser. I talked about Iowa and Minnesota teams that really have underwhelming rosters, teams that have not really added anybody to compensate for those underwhelming returning rosters. Well, Rutgers is not exactly the same case as them. They bring in an exceptional freshman class led by a duo of top 5-star recruits in Ace Bailey and Dylan Harper, and they will cause plenty of hype, right? They will make Rutgers a top 25 team in the preseason. They will garner all the preseason attention, but losing Cliff Amore, I think, is just absolutely pivotal. And that is why they are on my losers list. That loss in specific. They lost him to Alabama. And that was a guy that anchors the team, that would have been the only man over 6'7", I believe, because I think Rutgers is pretty undersized, and Amori would have added a lot. He's one of the best defensive forwards in the country, one of the best rim protectors in the country. And if they had him, I would be legitimately in on Rutgers because they lost him. I'm a little bit skeptical, right? There's definitely holes on that roster now. So Rutgers, while they added a great freshman class, they just lost a little bit because of the transfer portal, and that's why they're a loser for me.
I'm going to have to disagree here because I really think that Tyson Acuff, Zach Martini, Jordan Durkak from a lower level at Merrimack, I thought that Rutgers brought in some really good pieces to fit in with the freshman class. Now, I will say that you bring up a good point. They're bringing in these pieces, but it would be big to have your big player in Cliff Amori, especially with this talented freshman class. But I was close to having Rutgers as a winner. I'll just put that out there because I thought that they added a lot of really good pieces to try to blend together. So I'm interested to see now. Like, do you think Cliff is that key of a player to Rutgers' success? Because I still think Rutgers has maybe even a top 8 team in the Big Ten.
Yeah, and like I said, they will be top 25, I'm sure, in the preseason. Yep. I've seen all the hype in the world. It's just, like, specifically, I look at the roster, and what's the one thing they're missing? A rim-protecting, big, tall forward, right? And that's exactly what Amori is. So I'm like, he would have fit perfectly onto that roster. I think they're just slightly undersized. They have some versatility. They'll play good defense because Steve Pikiell is a great defensive coach. I think that's just the one thing they're missing.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, it's an interesting team to follow. Like, even before the transfer portal, Rutgers is a very interesting team to follow. I'll move on to my first winner here, and that's Indiana. And I'm sure that we probably are going to agree on Indiana because Oumar Ballo is arguably the best, if not a top 5 player in this transfer portal. So when you get a guy like him, you kind of are automatically a winner in the transfer portal, especially when you lose Peyton Sparks. Like, when they brought in Peyton Sparks from Ball State, I thought he was going to be a pretty big player for Indiana, right? You're moving on from Trace Jackson Davis, you get a pretty big man. And he didn't really work out. He didn't have a great year with Indiana. He goes back to Ball State, and you replace him with one of the best big men in the country. And then you get Miles Rice from Washington State. You're talking about a scoring guard who arguably could have gone to the NBA. Stays in college. You bring in Luke Goody from a rival team in Illinois, who was one of my losers. Talk about another guy that you lost in the portal. And Kanan Carlisle from Stanford, another scorer right there. I mean, Indiana is going to be loaded this season. A pivotal year for Mike Woodson, and he aced it in the transfer portal. Absolutely aced it. If we're talking winners in the transfer portal, not just from the Big Ten, but in college basketball, Indiana might be in my top 3.
Absolutely agree. They're my number 1 winner in the Big Ten, just coming off of an underwhelming year, right? They lose Khalil Ware as their center, and they absolutely, like you just said, they ace it with their replacement in Oumar Ballo. And then a couple of guys I want to just elaborate on. Miles Rice from Wazoo averaged 15 points, 4 assists after 2 redshirt seasons, right? The first one was a real red shirt, and then the second one was a medical red shirt after he was recovering from lymphoma treatment. So if he has 15 and 4 off of that, like not playing basketball for several years, I can't imagine what kind of star he'll be next year. And then Carlisle from Stanford, somebody who was the centerpiece of a pretty bad offense. I think the efficiency numbers will increase in a better situation. So that those just 5 players, the ones that I mentioned, and then all 3 players that transferred down. So that's a pretty good indication that you're doing well. I'll add another winner to this list, though. This is a new Big Ten team. It's weird including them in this Big Ten episode, but Oregon. They were a pretty consistent program under Dana Altman. They have been. They made their round of 32 last year as an 11 seed. And between their returners, they got Jackson Shelstad coming back. And then these veteran pieces I'll talk about that they added. I think they're setting up for a better team and having a better regular season than last year, where they were kind of on the right side of the bubble team. But 4 players I want to talk about. TJ Bamba from Villanova, coming off of a couple productive seasons. Supreme Cook from Georgetown, pretty much just a bright spot for the Hoyas team that was overall, again, not too great. Brandon Angle from Stanford, he's just a lethal shooter. I believe he shot nearly 45% last year, so that'll be huge for Oregon. And then Raheem Moss is an interesting guy for Toledo. Really good offensive player, but I think if you consider the situation, Toledo and the MAC are just like, it's a really high-octane offensive league. He was one of the best defensive players in that conference, so I think maybe as a defender, he might be even more impactful. So Oregon added some good guys. They have obviously always have players transfer out because you need to get rid of some scholarships. And that's really what happened. Like, these were not going to be key pieces that they lost. So Oregon absolutely going to be my second winner in addition to my big winner in Indiana.
Well, my next winner is the Minnesota Timberwolves. And I make that joke there because it's the Michigan Wolverines, because they bring in two big men, Vlad Golden and Danny Wolf. Obviously, Golden from FAU, Danny Wolf from Yale. And like the Timberwolves, who have Rudy Gobert and Karl Anthony Towns, clearly Michigan is not worried about having multiple 7-footers on this team. I wonder if they're going to play next to each other. I think there's a chance that they could, because they're both serviceable players. But it's just crazy that, I mean, you're not just talking about like two big men. You're talking about two of the best big men in the country, right? I mean, I think we can agree that Danny Wolf, even though he played at Yale, you look at his numbers, 14 points, 10 rebounds, 2.5 assists. He can shoot threes. Then you look at Vlad Golden, a guy that has tons of experience at FAU, 16 points, 7 rebounds. Isn't really, he doesn't have the range that Danny Wolf has. But I think they're going to be able to play them next to each other. There's no way one of these guys comes off the bench, right? I think they're both way too talented to come off the bench. If they do, I still think they're going to have to play next to each other, because you can't just play them both 20 minutes evenly. You're leaving too much talent off to the side to do that. But let's also bring up that Michigan got Trey Donaldson as well. So they got another guy from the SEC, a guard that can come in there and give more scoring. A Michigan team that was pretty bad last season, looking to move back in the right direction. They got some pretty high talent right here from multiple levels, right? A high mid-major, a pretty good mid-major, and a power conference. And they're looking to change it in Ann Arbor, and I think they're going to.
Yeah, Michigan made my honorable mentions winner list. I think that'll be a little bit weird how they fit in the two 7-footers in the court at the same time. And then also they do lose Terrace Reed and Doug McDaniel. Those are not unnotable. Like, those are notable losses, but I'd say it's definitely a net positive. But I think another new Big Ten team is a little bit of a bigger winner, Washington. They have 8 players coming in. A lot of them are like, but they have a couple absolutely big ones. Matt, talk to me about Great Osibor, because we had another episode earlier this offseason, and you were just raving about him. He is a phenomenal player from Utah State. So tell me about it a little bit.
No, I mean, like, he's more than just great, right? I mean, this guy, and he gets to follow his coach around, and that's the biggest thing for me. And I know I've mentioned it before, is that he gets to follow his coach that he played with all the way back to his days in Montana, and then obviously at Utah State. And that's just going to work out tremendously, especially when you go to a new conference. It's sort of like just like the perfect pairing when you're able to do that. So I think that's going to work out perfect.
And then more in the backcourt, they added DJ Davis, who's a very good scoring guard from Butler. He shot 95% from free throw land last year. I don't know, like, if that leads the country, but that's got to be up there. So very impressive for DJ Davis. And then Makai Mason from Rice. That's a guy who had some monster games last year. He had like some 27, 25, 30-point games. Not the most consistent, but like, I think that'll play. And then notable outs, Corin Johnson is off to Louisville, but that's not really much more than that. I mean, Keon Brooks graduates. I think if we're talking about Washington and offseason storylines, that's probably the biggest one, but you can't control that. Players just run out of eligibility, believe it or not, these days. And it's going to be hard to replace Keon Brooks' production, but I think because of getting Osibor and some other key pieces, they're going to stay afloat. So Washington, big winner in the Big Ten transfer portal cycle.
I'm excited to see what you think about my final winner because it's a very, I don't know, it's a risky pick, but I'm going with Michigan State. And I understand AJ Hoggard and the talent that he has. But sometimes I feel like there's certain schools where a guy can put up some numbers and people think he's better than he actually is. And I mean this in the best way because I believe that AJ Hoggard is a very talented player. But he goes into the transfer portal. And to me, if he were that talented, he would not wind up at Vanderbilt. That's my thought process there. Why Vanderbilt, right? Why is AJ Hoggard going to Vanderbilt? Doesn't really make sense. There's a lot of other teams. You might bring up NIL. I'm sure that another team out there would have offered him NIL to come to their team if AJ Hoggard was that much of a difference maker. And Michigan State gets Frankie Fiddler. Like Michigan, like Indiana, like these winners in the Big Ten. Because I don't think the Big Ten had a whole lot of true winners. And maybe that's why Michigan State is my third winner. But I just believe that he can be the difference maker. Michigan State didn't go nuts. They didn't really lose quantity. They didn't bring in quantity. They lost a very quality player at AJ Hoggard. And in my opinion, they brought in a more quality player in Frankie Fiddler. And for that reason, I think that Tom Izzo is a slight winner, but a winner nonetheless in the transfer portal.
I would agree with that assessment you had about the Big Ten. There's a lot of small winners. I think a couple that we didn't mention, Maryland maybe. They didn't have studs, but they replaced the end of their bench with just probably better, more exciting, younger bench pieces. I like Jacoby Gillespie from Belmont. That might be a big ad for them. UCLA, also a few solid ads, including Kobe Johnson. And then, of course, I had Michigan on there. You had them as a true winner. Matt, before we head off, though, I want to talk about Purdue because you were on the Big East episode and we talked about Marquette, who in a similar way just didn't have any movement in or out. And we said their roster will be relatively fine. But like Marquette, Purdue is losing an absolute star and even more of a star, the back-to-back National Player of the Year in Zach Edey. So, yes, there's value to stability, but do you think they're completely set just going on returning talent? Or do you think maybe they missed out a little bit? Because I think I'm not putting them as a winner or a loser, but I think they're notable neutral. I think they missed out a little bit. They could have done better.
Yeah, I agree with you. Like, Purdue was really close. I just felt like, and I'm glad you brought them up because I was very, like, both of us agreed a lot on Marquette, right? That by not doing anything, you effectively lose in the transfer portal. And I want to hold Purdue to the same standard. The only reason I didn't include them is because I thought that there were so many major losers in the Big Ten. And obviously I could have taken out Northwestern because in essence they had the same sort of like thing as Purdue. But I know that Purdue has a good freshman big man coming in. So they're hoping that he can down the line be the replacement to Zach Edey, if not this year, then in the future. And that's kind of the only reason I held off there. Because I know that they're trying to trust in him. And we'll see how that plays out. But I do agree. Like Purdue, like Marquette, drop the ball. I mean, you got a chance to bring in some talent and add to your chemistry, and you just didn't do it.
I'm just not sure it's sustainable. Like, it's great what they're doing now, right? They're
right.
We think that they're building some sort of culture, some sort of stability that the players know what exactly their role is, and they don't want to transfer out. Like, they don't. Like, I think those are the only two high major programs in the country that are like that. The problem is, I think the transfer portal will eventually catch up to them, and they will get losses. And now, will they know how to get guys back? That's my only concern there, because stability is valuable with Purdue and Marquette, and Purdue is probably doing it a little better. But that's my one concern there. But that will do it for today's edition of the CBB Review Studio podcast. Be sure to like this video if you enjoyed it. Be sure to subscribe as well. Appreciate that. And we will be back with the other high major conferences. We got the SEC and the Big 12 still to do. So that'll be out soon. Once again, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening, and take care.